On a plane, a prejudiced white woman degrades a black man, and she is horrified to learn who the black man is. As he boarded Flight 287, Tom Johnson glanced down the aisle. Travelers were already packing their belongings into overhead bins, and the cabin was humming with bustle. Muttering a courteous, "Excuse me," he steered past a few passengers who were still standing and headed for his seat a few rows back, close to the emergency exit. Over the top of her magazine, Karen White observed Tom. She had seen him as soon as he got on board, and she was struck by his composed manner. As he sat down and examined his suitcase, her gaze followed his every move. There was something strange about him that she couldn't quite place. She appeared to read the article in front of her, but she hadn't processed a single word, and her fingers pounded impatiently on the armrest. "Pardon me," Karen whispered softly, holding up a hand as flight attendant Linda went by. Linda stopped, smiling courteously. "Indeed, ma'am. How may I assist you?" Karen gave Tom, who was now turning the pages of his book, a quick glance. She leaned slightly nearer Linda and stated softly, "That man near the emergency exit. Is having someone like him sitting there truly safe?" Linda's eyes followed Karen's pointed look. She spotted Tom, who appeared completely at ease, engrossed in his book. Her smile remained steadfast, though a flicker of awareness passed through her gaze. "Everyone on board has gone through security, I promise you, ma'am. Our seating configurations adhere to safety standards." Karen pressed her lips into a thin line, her fingers gripping the armrest more tightly. "It's just, with everything you see on the news these days, you can't be too careful, can you?" Linda's practiced smile remained intact, but her eyes betrayed the faintest hint of exasperation. "If there's anything specific troubling you, ma'am," Linda said, her tone soothing but firm, "please don't hesitate to let me know. It's important to us that all passengers feel safe and comfortable during the flight." With a kind nod, she proceeded down the aisle. Karen felt a twinge of annoyance in her chest as she watched Linda leave. Why were the flight attendants so contemptuous? She shook her head and looked back at Tom, who had briefly put down his book and was now rummaging through his luggage. Her thoughts began to race. What did he want to find? What might he be concealing? Unable to take her eyes off of them, she shuffled uneasily in her chair. Ignorant of the attention, Tom took out his prescription and looked at the label. After a while, he put it back in the bag and went back to reading. He was gradually removing himself from the week's stress as he felt the serenity flood over him. He was unaware of the tension that was gradually growing behind him. As she proceeded with her pre-flight inspections, Linda went down the aisle. She looked at her co-worker Jim as she arrived at the rear of the aircraft. "Pay attention to seat 18C, she said, leaning closer. Regarding him, the passenger in 22A appears a little agitated. Jim gave a nod. "We'll work." "What's wrong?" Linda gave a small shrug. "Nothing particularly particular. I suppose it's just one of those instincts." She made an effort to ignore the discomfort. It was too early to know if this was one of those instances, but she had flown enough to see the warning signals of disaster coming. Karen moved around in her chair once again, her eyes narrowing as she kept her gaze on Tom. As takeoff approached, the plane's engines started to hum louder. With a serene expression on his face, Tom put his book away and gazed out the window, but Karen's thoughts were anything but. As the plane taxied down the runway, she gripped the armrests tighter, attempting to get rid of the dread that had taken hold of her chest. Karen reclined, but her eyes remained fixed on Tom. The nagging sense that something was amiss clung to her, refusing to dissipate, and if no one else took notice or action, she resolved silently that she would have to intervene herself. As the plane leveled smoothly after takeoff, the captain's composed voice filled the cabin via the intercom, extending a warm welcome to the passengers and outlining the details of the flight plan. Passengers started to become used to their routines as the seatbelt sign dinged off. While some had laptops, others chose to watch movies or read books while in flight. As they went down the aisles, flight attendants checked on passengers and gave them beverages. Tom Johnson reclined in his chair and looked out the window at the passing clouds. The strain in his shoulders started to release. Tom leaned down, carefully unzipping his carry-on bag to retrieve a compact water bottle, his movements calm and deliberate. Out of the corner of his eye, Tom noticed Karen's unrelenting stare. Her gaze felt sharp, like a spotlight trained on him, though he chose not to react. He hesitated briefly, registering her scrutiny, but quickly dismissed it, thinking she was simply scanning the cabin absent-mindedly. Unlike the passengers around her, who appeared at ease or immersed in their own activities, Karen's unease deepened with each passing minute. Her sharp eyes followed every movement as Tom slowly zipped his bag shut, his actions seeming almost suspicious in their precision. A nagging question circled her mind. What could he possibly be hiding in that bag? The repeated way he seemed to check his bag, as if ensuring its contents were still intact, only fueled her growing suspicions. Karen's gaze shifted restlessly to the other passengers, scanning their faces for any sign that someone else had noticed what she had. Yet, to her frustration, most passengers remained engrossed in their own activities, seemingly oblivious to the potential threat Karen believed she had identified. Her growing unease compelled her to act. She lifted a hand, signaling for Linda, one of the flight attendants, to come over. Spotting Karen's gesture, Linda made her way over with her usual professional smile, a calm and approachable demeanor in place. "Yes, ma'am? How can I assist you?" Linda inquired, her voice maintaining an air of warmth and practiced professionalism. Karen leaned slightly forward, her voice hushed and conspiratorial as though she didn't want to alarm the other passengers. "You see that man sitting near the emergency exit?" she began, her tone tinged with urgency. "I've been keeping an eye on him, and he keeps fiddling with his bag like he's worried someone will notice what's inside," Karen whispered sharply. "I think you ought to check it out just to be sure," she added, her voice insistent. Linda followed Karen's gaze briefly toward Tom before returning her attention, her composed demeanor betraying no hint of concern. "I understand your concern, ma'am," Linda began carefully, "but we are unable to inspect another passenger's belongings without a valid reason or a clear sign of a potential issue. From what I've observed, he hasn't caused any disturbance, and his behavior seems perfectly normal," she explained. Karen's expression hardened, her frustration evident. "Normal? How can you even suggest that?" she challenged. "People like him always seem normal at first. It's always like that, until it's not." "I've seen enough news stories to know the signs," Karen insisted, her voice low but firm. "We can't just sit idly by and assume it's fine." "What if there's something dangerous hidden in that bag?" she pressed, her tone growing sharper. Linda remained poised, her professional training evident in her calm yet firm response. "Ma'am, please understand we have stringent security measures in place. Every passenger, including the gentleman you're referring to, underwent thorough screening before boarding," she assured. "I encourage you to try and relax for now. If you observe anything specific or concerning, don't hesitate to inform us," Linda added gently. Karen let out an exasperated huff, folding her arms across her chest. "You never take these things seriously. Not until it's too late," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with frustration. Though Linda caught Karen's muttered remark, she decided not to engage further. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod and moved on down the aisle, doing her best to refocus and let the tense exchange fade into the background. Years of handling challenging passengers had taught Linda the importance of staying calm and cautious, but something about this situation felt uniquely unsettling, as though it carried the weight of something more serious. Linda felt worried by the determination and intensity in Karen's eyes. As she passed Tom's seat, Linda gave him a fleeting glance. Sensing the momentary change in focus, Tom raised his head and looked her in the eyes. The moment went by without any words, as Linda smiled courteously and he nodded in return. She had no idea why Karen's worry felt so urgent. Although she had previously dealt with anxious or suspicious passengers, something about this particular circumstance bothered her. Karen felt ignored and irritated as she watched Linda leave. She turned to face the other travelers, some of whom had given her a sidelong glance during the conversation. Apparently unconcerned, they had gone back to their own hobbies. Kick. Karen's irritation grew. How could they all be so relaxed? She leaned over to her middle-aged neighbor who was reading a magazine. "Pardon me?" Karen said. "That man by the exit? Did you notice him? You think he's strange?" Startled by the abrupt inquiry, the woman looked up. She turned to face Tom, who had resumed reading his book. "I'm not sure," she said nervously. "I think he looks excellent. What's wrong?" Karen frowned, her lips pressing together tightly as a wave of irritation rose at the other woman's apparent indifference. "That man has been acting suspiciously ever since we got on this flight," Karen began, her voice gaining a slightly sharper edge. "He keeps messing with his bag, like there's something in there he doesn't want anyone to notice," she added pointedly. "The flight attendant didn't seem to care when I tried to tell them. Being safe is preferable to being sorry, isn't it?" The woman looked back at Karen and then back to Tom. "Perhaps. However, I believe the team would take care of the issue if it actually existed." She turned back to her magazine and added, "I'm sure it's nothing." Karen's jaw tightened in fury. She now realized that she would have to take this seriously if no one else did. Determined not to let Tom leave her sight, she continued to stare at him. She kept an eye on everything, looking for any clue that might confirm her suspicions. Unaware of Karen's inspection, Tom kept reading and periodically sipped water. Lost in his book, he was happy. The plane's engines hummed steadily, providing a soothing background. His thoughts strayed to the case he was working on and his next meeting in Los Angeles. He was unaware that someone's building mistrust was going to escalate into something far more disruptive, only a few rows behind him. The more minutes that went by, the more uneasy Karen felt. Events and news reports kept replaying in her head, each one escalating her anxieties. Persuaded that danger was imminent, she felt her heartbeat speed. She would be prepared, observe, and wait. She would be the first to intervene if Tom made even one mistake. The typical sounds of a long-haul trip filled Trip 287's cabin, including the hum of the engines, the rustle of pages turning, and the sporadic clink of a drink card. The majority of passengers were at ease, either nodding off or absorbed in their in-flight entertainment. However, Karen White's mistrust and annoyance became stronger by the moment as her gaze stayed on Tom Johnson. Karen's worry increased each time Tom reached down to inspect his suitcase. Her cheeks flushed with heat as her thoughts spiraled into increasingly alarming conclusions. To her, this kind of behavior wasn't just unusual, it was a red flag she couldn't ignore. In Karen's mind, no one would feel the need to check their bag so frequently unless they were concealing something suspicious. Karen felt an almost overwhelming responsibility to take action, but every time she thought about directly confronting the man, she hesitated, torn between her conviction and the uncertainty of how he might react. Finally, her patience wore thin, and Karen leaned toward the elderly man seated beside her, her voice carrying the weight of urgency she could no longer suppress. "Excuse me," she said in a low whisper, careful not to draw too much attention to herself or their conversation. "Have you noticed the man sitting near the emergency exit?" Karen continued, her voice tinged with both concern and suspicion. "He keeps reaching down to check that bag of his. Doesn't that seem odd, or even a little suspicious to you?" The elderly man paused, slowly lifting his head from his crossword puzzle and adjusting his glasses, his expression a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance. Her eyes darted around the cabin, scanning the faces of other passengers, searching for validation or even a flicker of shared concern. But everyone seemed oblivious, caught up in their own distractions, completely unaware of the danger she believed was looming. Honestly, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Karen became very irritated. How did they all become so blind? She glanced about in the hopes of attracting another traveler's attention. To see what she saw, she needed someone to confirm her worries. Her eyes fell on a young woman seated across the aisle who appeared to be curiously observing Tom. Karen spoke softly as she bent over. "Please pardon me. Is that man by the exit visible to you? You think he's strange? As if he's concealing something?" The young lady looked from Karen to Tom and back again. She had a courteous but bored look on her face. Slowly, she answered, "I don't know. He's probably just reading." "Is there a problem?" Karen lost her patience. "Indeed there is," Karen exclaimed softly but forcefully. "He's been acting suspiciously ever since we got on this plane. Keeps looking through his bag as if it contained something hazardous. The flight attendant has been informed, but nothing is being done about it." The young lady moved uneasily in her chair. "It might be preferable to let the flight crew handle it. This is what they're trained for, right?" Others in the car took notice as Karen's voice raised a little. "By then, what if it's too late? What if something occurred that we could have avoided? It's not just me who has this feeling." She tried to elicit support from those around her by speaking in a forceful tone. Some of the passengers glanced at Tom, who was not conscious of the attention. He read on. He loosened his stance. Linda, one of the flight attendants, noticed the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere as more heads turned, and she quickly made her way toward Karen's seat. Her voice was forceful but low as she leaned down. "Please don't raise your voice, ma'am. We don't wish to annoy other travelers. What appears to be the issue?" Karen pointed to Tom with a determined look on her face. "That man has been acting strangely. I've been telling you. He keeps looking into his luggage. He's working on a project. I am aware of that." Continuing to act professionally, Linda inhaled deeply. "I've already talked to you about this, ma'am. Without verifiable proof of a threat, we are unable to intervene. Please, you need to calm down. We are keeping an eye on the matter, I promise." Through the din of the cabin, Karen's voice became louder. "Observing? Even so, what does that mean? Are you simply going to wait for a horrible event to occur? That is insufficient." Some passengers were anxious, while others became agitated as they began to whisper. At last, Tom noticed the change in the air and looked up. He briefly looked at Karen with a puzzled expression on his face. Linda observed the rising tide of attention Karen was garnering, and quickly realized she needed to act to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, I understand that you're worried, but creating a scene and alarming the other passengers won't solve anything," Linda said, her voice firm yet calm. "If you don't quiet down, I'll have to ask the captain to intervene." Karen's face reddened with rage as she suddenly stood up. "You're not understanding, all of you are blind. There's a problem and I won't just sit here and do nothing." The relative silence of the cabin was broken by the sharpness of her voice. Whispers began to circulate among the passengers as more heads turned. In an attempt to help Karen return to her seat, Linda put a touch on her arm. "Please have a seat, ma'am. Let's have a calm conversation about this." Karen pointed straight at Tom and shook Linda's hand off. "He's concealing something. I insist that his bag be searched immediately." Tom's eyes became a little wider. He glanced back at Karen and then around at the assembling crowd. He put his book on his lap and closed it calmly. He didn't raise his voice to confront Karen's charge. Instead, it was measured. "I promise you, ma'am, that nothing hazardous is in my suitcase. All I want is a calm flight like everyone else's." Indignation was burning in Karen's eyes. "Flight in peace? Do you think we'll believe that? What do you have hidden there?" With a calm yet authoritative voice, Linda moved between Tom and Karen. "All right, that's sufficient. We're not going to talk about this here. Please sit down, sir or ma'am. I appreciate your patience." She looked across at the other travelers. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't lose your cool. There's nothing to be concerned about. Kindly take your seats again." The low murmurs of conversation began to swell, and Linda could sense the tension in the cabin building. She knew she had to take decisive action to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. She gestured for help from another flight attendant. They helped Karen back into her seat, gently yet firmly. Karen persisted in objecting, her voice a low, irate murmur. Tom remained seated with an inscrutable face. He saw Karen sit down at last, her distrustful gaze still fixed on him. Despite feeling the tension in the air, he maintained his calm. With so many people watching them, he knew better than to get involved. Instead, he reached for his book, carefully flipping back to the page where he had left off. He resumed reading, projecting an air of calm that stood in sharp contrast to the unrest brewing in the cabin. Linda, now stationed at the front of the cabin, offered the passengers a reassuring smile. With a composed stride, she made her way to the galley to contact the captain and update him on the situation. She knew it was crucial to brief the captain about the unfolding events, ensuring he was prepared to intervene if the situation intensified further. As she lifted the intercom phone, Linda stole a glance back toward the cabin. Tom appeared as composed as ever, while Karen's intense, suspicious gaze remained fixated, her emotions seemingly unrelenting. She let out a sigh. The flight was going to be lengthy. Although the cabin was filled with the sound of the airplane engines, the stress was evident. Passengers looked at each other anxiously, some conversing, others seeming to concentrate on their screens or books. Furious, Karen sat in her chair. She was unable to comprehend why. She was not being taken seriously. She caught bits of speech as she looked around. They were all discussing her. She sensed it. It didn't matter, though. She was aware of her correctness. Karen's gaze returned to Tom. Unfazed by the scene she had created, he was reading calmly. She was even more annoyed by his composure. If he wasn't concealing something, how could he sit there so composedly? Her mind swirled. She would have to act on her own initiative if no one else did. The weight of Karen's stare caused Tom to shift in his chair. She was staring at him as he looked up for a moment. Her eyes were narrowed, her jaw set. He knew that look well. It was the look of someone convinced they had uncovered a threat, someone who wouldn't back down. He sighed quietly, turning back to his book. But he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. Karen couldn't stand it anymore. Her patience snapped. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, making her way down the aisle toward Tom. All around her, passengers turned their heads. Their curiosity piqued as they observed her quick and determined steps. Tom's attention shifted upward, sensing the movement and presence of someone approaching him. He calmly placed his book on his lap and met her intense gaze head-on. "You!" Karen hissed, her tone accusatory and brimming with unspoken allegations. The cabin's quiet murmurs were broken by Karen's loud voice. "I'd like to know what's now in that bag." Her finger quivered with rage as she aimed straight at Tom. Tom remained composed. "There's nothing in this bag that worries you, ma'am," he said calmly and quietly. "Sit down, please. You're creating a commotion." With a worried expression on her face, Linda hurried down the aisle. "Ma'am, I must insist that you return to your seat," Linda said, placing a firm but gentle hand on Karen's arm in an attempt to de-escalate the encounter. "The other passengers are being disturbed by you." Karen dismissed Linda, concentrating solely on Tom. "No, until he opens that bag, I will not sit down. I am aware that he is concealing something harmful. You're all too blind to see the reality, so I won't allow this jet to be in danger." Tom glanced at Linda, who was attempting to maintain her poise. He noticed the concern in her eyes, a reflection of her fear that the situation was on the brink of spiraling beyond control. He spoke in a cool, collected tone. "I only have personal belongings in my bag, ma'am. Nothing here poses a threat to anyone, I assure you." Karen let out a quick, brief laugh. "Promises? Do you believe we should believe what you say? No one is fooled by you. Ever since we boarded, I have been observing you. You've been fidgeting with that bag over and over like you're afraid someone might uncover whatever it is you're hiding," she added, her voice growing louder with each word. "I don't mind calling you out, though." In an attempt to act as a barrier, Linda moved in between Karen and Tom. She spoke firmly. "That's sufficient. Ma'am, please. Now you must go back to your seat. I'll have to involve the captain if you keep interfering with the flight." By now, the heated exchange had captured the attention of nearly every passenger, their gazes fixed on the unfolding drama. Some leaned out into the aisle to get a clearer view, while others exchanged hushed whispers with their neighbors speculating about the situation. Tom stayed seated, his expression calm and unreadable, his hands resting lightly on his book as if to convey his lack of alarm. He understood that any action on his part could easily be misinterpreted and might worsen the already tense situation. Karen seemed to disregard Linda entirely, her unwavering gaze fixed on Tom as if he were the sole focus of her concerns. "Until someone takes action, I won't sit down. I'll let them know what's going on here if nobody else would listen." Her face flushed with rage as her voice increased with every word. Linda lowered her voice, almost begging, and turned to Tom. "I apologize, sir, but would you mind showing her what's in your bag? Perhaps this can be settled amicably if she realizes she has nothing to be concerned about." Tom glanced first at Linda and then at Karen, who had a stern expression on her face. Tom inhaled deeply, the weight of the situation pressing on him before nodding slowly in agreement. "All right," he said calmly. "If it helps restore peace in the cabin, I'll do it." With deliberate movements, Tom leaned forward, unzipped his carry-on bag, and retrieved a small, transparent plastic case. Inside, clearly visible, were vials of medication. He raised the case into view, ensuring both Karen and Linda could see its contents without any ambiguity. "This," he began, holding the case steady, "is what's in my bag." His voice remained calm and measured. "It's medicine. I must always have this with me because I have a cardiac issue." Linda gave a relieved nod. "You see that? This place isn't unsafe." She looked over at Karina. "Please, let's move on from this and have a nice flight." Karen's expression, however, contorted in shock. She took a step forward, Tom, and shook her head. "No, that isn't it. It can't be all of that. You're telling lies. You must be." Tom's cool attitude remained unchanged. "I'm telling the truth, ma'am. This is the reality. Sit down, please." Karen's gaze darted about, looking for other passengers to provide assistance. "Isn't it obvious that he's attempting to deceive us? This is incorrect. We must thoroughly search him." Linda took a stand and spoke firmly. "That's enough, ma'am. I'll have to take additional action if you don't sit down now." Ignoring her, Karen extended her hand as though to seize Tom's bag. Tom stopped her before she did, taking her wrist firmly yet gently. His expression was serene, but his grip was tight. "Ma'am, I ask you not to do this," Tom said quietly, his voice steady and authoritative. "Such behavior is unnecessary." With startled eyes, Karen jerked her hand back. "You're all conspiring to protect him, aren't you?" Karen accused, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and desperation. "Every single one of you is protecting him and turning a blind eye to the truth," she added, her tone escalating. Karen took a step back, her voice climbing to a near-hysterical pitch as she tried to rally support for her accusations. Linda acted swiftly, signaling to a fellow flight attendant to assist her as the situation continued to intensify. "Please join us, ma'am. A conversation with you is necessary." As they reached the back of the plane, Karen hesitated, her eyes scanning the cabin. She noticed some passengers looking at her with sympathy while others cast judgmental glances. She cast one last glance at Tom, her belief in his guilt unwavering. However, realizing she had no support and faced the unyielding resolve of the flight attendants, Karen reluctantly complied. Her steps were slow and hesitant as she allowed herself to be led away. Tom observed as Karen was escorted to the rear of the plane, fully aware of the many eyes in the cabin now directed toward him. He calmly retrieved his book, flipping through the pages to locate where he had left off, intent on regaining his focus. Despite the thick tension hanging in the air and the growing hum of whispers among the passengers, Tom fixed his attention on the book, steadfast in his resolve not to let the situation affect him. He had already dealt with worse. As Linda guided Karen toward the back, she briefly glanced over her shoulder at Tom, offering him a subtle nod of gratitude for his composure. Tom returned the gesture with a quiet nod, a shared acknowledgement of the delicate situation they were both navigating. He recognized that the ordeal wasn't fully resolved, but at least for now, the immediate risk of further escalation had been contained. Tom carefully turned the page of his book, his face remaining an unyielding mask of calm composure as the plane continued its smooth journey through the clouds toward the west. The atmosphere inside the cabin was taut with tension, as though an invisible string had been pulled too tight and was teetering on the verge of snapping. While most passengers had returned to their seats, a noticeable number still cast wary glances toward the back of the plane, where Karen now sat under close observation. The subdued hum of conversation had grown louder, filled with speculative whispers and an undercurrent of unease about what had just transpired. Tom was acutely aware of the weight of countless eyes fixed on him, yet he remained steadfast, keeping his gaze on the open book in his hands and projecting an air of serene composure. At the rear of the plane, Karen sat stiffly in a seat typically reserved for flight crew. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her face was flushed a deep red with lingering anger. Linda stood patiently beside Karen, her tone calm as she attempted to reason with her, but it was clear from Karen's rigid demeanor that her mind was firmly set. Even though Karen's voice was lowered to a whisper, it was laced with sharp indignation that cut through the tension like a knife. "I'm telling you, that man is lying," Karen insisted, her voice firm as she clung stubbornly to her belief. "He has to be hiding something. People like him always do," she added, her conviction unshaken despite the evidence presented. "They always have a story, a convenient excuse ready to throw everyone off the scent," she said, her words sharp and accusatory. Linda's voice remained steady and soothing, a stark contrast to Karen's fiery tone as she worked to maintain control over the situation. "Ma'am, I completely understand your concerns, but Mr. Johnson has already shown us his medication and explained its purpose," Linda began, her tone patient yet firm. "There is absolutely no indication that he poses any kind of threat to this flight or its passengers," she continued, hoping her reassurances would calm Karen. "I need you to take a moment to calm down and consider that everything is under control. Our top priority is ensuring the safety and comfort of everyone on board. And right now, your behavior is contributing to a heightened sense of alarm among the passengers." Karen shook her head adamantly, her eyes blazing with a mixture of frustration and disbelief, as though she couldn't fathom why no one was siding with her. "You just don't get it, do you?" she retorted, her voice tinged with exasperation. "You're blind to what's right in front of you. That man is dangerous and I can feel it," Karen declared, her conviction unwavering despite Linda's calm reassurances. "I know he's hiding something and I won't be convinced otherwise," she insisted, crossing her arms tightly. "If none of you are willing to take action, then I'll have no choice but to handle it myself." Linda exhaled deeply, a soft sigh that betrayed her realization that reasoning with Karen any further would be an exercise in futility. She gave a subtle nod to Jim, her fellow flight attendant, who stood at the ready just a few steps away, prepared to intervene if necessary. "Ma'am, it's imperative that you remain calm for the remainder of the flight. This situation cannot escalate further. If this disruptive behavior continues, we'll have no alternative but to involve law enforcement upon our arrival," Linda warned, her words carrying a clear message of consequence. Karen's eyes grew wide with a mix of shock and anger at Linda's words. She leaned back in her seat, momentarily rendered silent by the gravity of the warning. After a brief pause, Karen muttered under her breath, her tone dripping with defiance, "You'll all regret ignoring me when it's too late." Linda made the decision to leave Karen under Jim's watchful eye and returned to her duties, walking back down the aisle to tend to the other passengers. Her priority now was to check on the other passengers, offering reassurance to ease their nerves and ensuring that the situation didn't escalate again. As Linda neared Tom's seat, she noticed several passengers quickly averting their gazes, pretending they hadn't been watching him intently just moments before. Linda came to a halt beside Tom's seat, prompting him to look up from his book with a calm yet inquisitive expression. "Mr. Johnson," Linda began softly, her voice low enough to avoid drawing unnecessary attention from nearby passengers. "I sincerely apologize for the disturbance and the situation you've had to endure," she said, her tone filled with genuine regret. "Is there anything I can do for you right now? Anything you might need?" she asked, her professionalism unwavering despite the tension. Tom shook his head gently, offering a small, understanding smile. "No, thank you. I'm fine," he replied, his voice calm and measured. I know these situations can occur, and I appreciate the way you're handling it," he added, his demeanor composed. "Your professionalism hasn't gone unnoticed, and I'm grateful for that," he continued, offering her a nod of appreciation. Linda paused for a moment, then leaned slightly closer to Tom, ensuring her next words were spoken quietly enough for only him to hear. "I wanted to make sure there's no lingering misunderstanding or discomfort on your part," she said, her tone both empathetic and professional. "If there's anything at all that you need during the rest of the flight, please don't hesitate to let us know," she added, her sincerity evident. "Our priority is ensuring your comfort and safety, as well as that of all the other passengers," Linda concluded, her words a blend of reassurance and professionalism. Tom nodded in response, recognizing the genuine concern in her voice and appreciating her efforts. "Thank you for that," he said simply, his calm tone conveying his gratitude. "I'm just looking forward to reaching Los Angeles without any further issues," he added, his gaze steady and composed. Linda offered a faint but reassuring smile before continuing down the aisle to check on the other passengers, her focus now shifting to maintaining order and calm throughout the cabin. Tom's gaze followed Linda briefly as she moved away, before he redirected his attention to his book, attempting to immerse himself in its pages and recenter his thoughts. Despite his efforts, the lingering tension in the cabin made it nearly impossible for Tom to fully concentrate on the words before him. He could still feel the weight of the passengers' gazes, accompanied by the faint hum of whispers that had erupted following Linda's conversation with Karen. Tom realized that the rising unease in the cabin called for some sort of action on his part to help diffuse the situation and restore calm. Tom set his book aside momentarily, scanning the cabin with a discerning gaze to gauge the mood and assess the reactions of those around him. Taking a slow, steadying breath, Tom stood from his seat with measured movements, gently placing his book down on the cushion behind him. Reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, he retrieved his badge, its metallic sheen catching the cabin's muted light. Displaying his badge wasn't something he did lightly, but under the circumstances, he knew it might be the most effective way to address the growing tension. Tom made his way down the aisle with deliberate steps, stopping beside Linda. His voice, though calm, was projected just enough for the nearby passengers to hear clearly. "Excuse me, everyone," he began, his tone commanding attention without being confrontational. "May I have a moment of your time?" The murmurs in the cabin faded almost instantly as passengers turned their heads toward him, their curiosity piqued by his composed demeanor. Raising his badge high enough for everyone to see, Tom ensured its authenticity was unmistakable. "My name is Detective Tom Johnson," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "I'm an undercover police detective with the New York Police Department," he explained, his tone calm yet firm. "I've been on an assignment and the medication in my bag is for a heart condition that requires consistent management," he continued, addressing the primary source of Karen's concerns directly. "I sincerely apologize if any of my actions or behavior caused unease among you, but I assure you all, there is absolutely no threat here," Tom said, his sincerity evident in every word. The cabin fell into a momentary hush, a stunned silence hanging in the air as passengers processed his words. Some passengers appeared visibly relieved, others looked surprised, and a few exchanged quiet glances, nodding in subtle agreement as the tension began to dissipate. Tom's composed and authoritative tone appeared to resonate with many of the passengers, easing their initial apprehensions and replacing them with a sense of reassurance. He glanced toward Linda, who responded with a slight nod of gratitude, clearly appreciative of his proactive approach in calming the cabin. The fragile silence was abruptly shattered by Karen's voice, loud and filled with indignation, cutting through the cabin from her seat at the back. "You're lying! That's just a convenient cover story, isn't it? How can any of us be sure that badge is even legitimate? For all we know, you're using that badge as a front to smuggle something dangerous onto this plane." Tom shifted to face her directly, his expression calm and unwavering despite the mounting hostility. "Ma'am, if it will ease your concerns, you are welcome to contact my department and verify my credentials. The contact information is clearly printed on the back of my badge. I want to make it clear that I am not here to harm anyone like everyone else on this flight. I'm simply trying to do my job and reach my destination safely." Karen's face reddened further, her eyes wide and blazing with anger as her suspicions refused to wane. "No, I don't believe you. This is just another trick to throw us off. You might fool them, but you can't fool me." The previously calming atmosphere began to erode, replaced once more by a rising tension that swept through the cabin like a slow-building storm. Tom noticed the fear lurking behind Karen's fiery gaze, a clear sign that panic and paranoia had firmly taken hold of her thoughts. Tom understood that no amount of reasoning or explanation would sway Karen's deeply rooted suspicions, but he knew that maintaining his calm was crucial to keeping the situation from spiraling further out of control. "Ma'am," Tom began, "I understand that you're scared, but I assure you, there's absolutely no reason to fear me or my intentions. Let's focus on finishing this flight peacefully, without any further disturbances or conflict. Once we land, you'll be free to contact the authorities and have everything about me and my identity verified thoroughly." Karen shook her head furiously, her breaths coming in quick, shallow bursts and her voice quivering with emotion as she refused to relent. "No, I won't wait," she cried out. "I won't just sit here and do nothing while you… Her voice tapered off into silence as her thoughts seemed to unravel, leaving her unable to articulate her accusations further. Linda moved closer, stepping forward with a steady posture, her voice taking on a tone of assertive authority. "Ma'am, I must ask you to sit down immediately. We've already spoken with Mr. Johnson and confirmed that everything is under control. It's imperative that you remain calm for the sake of everyone's safety and peace of mind." Karen's eyes darted across the cabin, noticing the many passengers who were now openly watching her. While some wore expressions of concern, others looked at her with evident disapproval. The realization that she stood completely alone in her suspicions hit her, and the lack of support from her fellow passengers only seemed to fuel her frustration further. With visible reluctance, Karen sank back into her seat, her head shaking in disbelief, and her lips pressed tightly together in silent protest. Tom observed Karen quietly for a brief moment before turning his attention back to Linda, who was already working to reestablish calm. "Thank you for handling this," Tom said softly, returning to his seat. Tom was acutely aware of the lingering stares from the passengers around him. Tom lowered himself into his seat, carefully retrieved his book, and opened it to his last page. For the next several minutes, the cabin was enveloped in an uneasy silence. While the tension remained palpable, it no longer felt as though the situation was on the brink of spiraling out of control. Gradually, passengers started to ease back into their routines, directing their attention toward their in-flight entertainment, personal books, or quiet conversations with seatmates. Linda moved with practiced calm through the cabin, checking on passengers to ensure everyone was settled. Her eyes occasionally flicked between Tom and Karen, remaining alert and ready to intervene if necessary. At the rear of the plane, Karen sat rigidly in her seat. Her face was noticeably pale, and her hands trembled subtly as the adrenaline from earlier began to subside. Karen could feel the heavy weight of the passengers' stares pressing down on her, their judgment palpable in the fleeting glances and hushed whispers. She couldn't comprehend why no one seemed to share her perspective, why they all appeared to take Tom's explanation at face value. Yet, despite her convictions, she felt unable to continue her fight, the earlier outbursts leaving her both emotionally and physically drained. Now isolated in her fear, Karen resigned herself to wait until they landed, knowing she lacked the support or influence to act further. Tom sat silently in his seat, his eyes fixed on his book, but his senses remained heightened, attuned to every small movement or shift in the cabin around him. While he knew the situation was not fully resolved, he held on to a cautious hope that the most volatile moments were now behind them. Tom concentrated on maintaining steady, controlled breaths, ensuring his heart rate remained even as he worked to keep himself calm and composed. With several hours still remaining in the flight, Tom was acutely aware that the situation, while contained for now, could shift again at any moment. The atmosphere within Flight 287 remained tense, despite Tom's earlier attempts at reassurance. While a number of passengers had returned to their routines with varying degrees of ease, others periodically cast cautious glances toward Tom's seat or the back of the plane where Karen sat, isolated and visibly fuming. The quiet murmur of conversation was subdued, almost hushed, as though the passengers collectively feared that speaking too loudly might reignite the tension that had only recently begun to dissipate. Linda navigated the aisles with deliberate care, pausing to offer reassurances to passengers who appeared unsettled, her every action aimed at maintaining an air of normalcy despite the earlier drama. Linda could almost feel the unease rippling through the cabin, emanating from the rear of the plane where Karen sat, her intense gaze still radiating frustration and disbelief. Lynn? Linda was aware that she needed to control the situation. She could not allow the situation to worsen. Jim, stationed nearby, kept a vigilant eye on Karen. Karen sat stiffly in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a resolute mask of defiance that refused to soften. Jim was no stranger to handling challenging passengers, but there was something distinctly unsettling about Karen's unrelenting intensity. The combination of Karen's palpable fear and simmering anger created an atmosphere that felt precariously unstable to those around her. His voice was low as he bent to Linda as she came closer. "She's still visibly agitated," Jim said in a low voice. "I doubt she's going to calm down on her own anytime soon." Linda gave a brief nod, her gaze shifting toward Karen as she assessed the situation for herself. "I know," Linda replied. "We need to ensure she doesn't cause any further disruptions during the flight." "Can you stay close by and do what you can to keep her calm?" Linda asked, her tone a mixture of request and instruction. "I'm going to speak with the captain and see if there are any additional precautions we should consider." Jim nodded in agreement. "I'll do what I can." Linda turned and began making her way toward the front of the plane. As Linda entered the cockpit, Captain Samuel Harris swiveled in his seat to face her, his expression marked by a calm yet serious demeanor that reflected his awareness of the unfolding situation. "What's the current situation, Linda?" Captain Harris asked, his tone steady but tinged with concern. "For now, we've been able to de-escalate the situation. However, the passenger in question, Karen, remains visibly agitated and hasn't fully calmed down. She refuses to believe Mr. Johnson's explanation, even after he showed his badge and clarified the contents of his bag. I'm worried she might attempt another outburst or escalate the situation further." Captain Harris's brow furrowed slightly. "We cannot risk another disruption during this flight. Another incident could easily spark panic among the passengers. If it comes down to it, we may need to consider restraining her to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone on board," Captain Harris stated, his words measured but firm. Linda nodded in agreement, fully understanding the gravity of the captain's directive and the potential consequences of further escalation. "I'll continue to monitor her closely. Jim is stationed nearby, and he's actively working to keep her calm and de-escalate any signs of agitation. We'll make every effort to avoid the use of restraints, but we'll be prepared to act decisively if the situation demands it." Captain Harris gave a brief nod, signaling his approval of the plan and trust in Linda's judgment. "Keep me informed of any developments. If the situation deteriorates, I'll notify air traffic control and arrange for security personnel to meet us upon landing," he added, outlining the next steps should escalation occur. Linda exited the cockpit, her thoughts racing as she mentally prepared a series of contingency plans to address any potential challenges. Linda walked briskly back to the rear of the plane, where Jim remained stationed close to Karen's seat, his stance alert and watchful. As Linda neared, Karen glanced up, her eyes glinting with defiance and a stubborn determination that showed no signs of wavering. "So, have you come back to admit I was right? Or to apologize for doubting me?" Linda shook her head slowly, her tone remaining calm yet firm as she prepared to address Karen's combative attitude. "No, ma'am," Linda began, her words measured. "I'm here to check in and make sure you're doing okay at the moment. It's crucial that everyone remains calm and cooperative so we can complete this flight without further disruptions." Karen's jaw clenched visibly, her frustration evident in the rigid set of her features as she braced herself to respond. Cooperative. You mean you just want everyone to fall in line and be compliant? You expect me to sit back and do absolutely nothing while that man goes through with whatever dangerous plan he's hiding? I won't be part of this charade. It's unbelievable that all of you are falling for his lies so easily. Linda inhaled deeply, steadying herself before responding to Karen's escalating frustration. Ma'am, I can assure you that Mr. Johnson is not lying, Linda said firmly, her voice unwavering as she spoke. He has provided us with his credentials, and there is absolutely no indication that he poses any kind of threat to this flight or its passengers. However, your actions and behavior are causing visible concern and discomfort among the other passengers. I must ask you to stay calm and remain seated for the duration of the flight. If you are unable to comply, we may have to take additional measures to ensure the safety of everyone on board. Karen's eyes grew wide. Further measures? What do you mean by that? Are you going to arrest me now? I'm the only one here trying to keep everyone safe. Linda locked eyes with Karen, her steady gaze reflecting both authority and an attempt at understanding. Ma'am, it's our duty to ensure the safety of all passengers on this flight, and that includes you. If this behavior continues, we may have no choice but to restrain you for the remainder of the flight to prevent further disruptions, Linda warned. I need you to remain calm and stay in your seat. Karen glared defiantly at Linda, but there was something in the firmness of her voice that seemed to cut through her anger, forcing her to pause. Reluctantly, Karen leaned back into her seat, still rigid with frustration, but her voice dropped to a quieter tone. Fine, she muttered. But if anything goes wrong, it's on you, all of you. Linda gave a slight nod, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. At least for the moment, it seemed Karen was willing to comply. Signaling discreetly to Jim to remain vigilant, Linda resumed her duties, walking the aisles to check on other passengers, offering them calming smiles and words of reassurance. Although the tension in the cabin remained palpable, it no longer felt as though it was teetering on the brink of chaos. As Linda made her way methodically down the aisle, Tom observed her approach from his seat, his calm gaze tracking her movements. From his seat, Tom had been silently observing the unfolding events, acutely aware of every subtle movement and shift in the cabin's tense atmosphere. Tom noted the weariness etched on Linda's face, the way her eyes shifted repeatedly between him and the rear of the plane, reflecting her vigilance. When Linda finally arrived at his seat, Tom looked up at her, his expression calm and reassuring despite the underlying tension. "How are things going back there?" Tom asked in a low, measured tone, his concern evident despite his calm demeanor. Linda let out a quiet sigh, the weight of the situation momentarily reflected in her demeanor. "She's still upset," Linda admitted, her voice tinged with fatigue. "But at least she's staying seated for now. We're keeping a very close eye on her to ensure there are no further issues," she added, her tone resolute. "I'm truly sorry that this entire situation has caused you so much trouble," Linda said, her sincerity evident in her apology. "We're doing everything in our power to handle this as carefully and professionally as possible," she added, her words carrying both reassurance and determination. Tom gave a brief nod, acknowledging her efforts with quiet understanding. "I know you're doing your best," he said calmly. "You've handled everything remarkably well given the circumstances. If there's anything I can do to assist or make this easier for you, please let me know," Tom offered, his voice steady and supportive. Linda managed a small, appreciative smile, her expression softening slightly in response to his kind words. "Just continue staying calm," Linda replied. "The less we escalate the situation, the smoother this will go for everyone." Tom turned his attention back to his book, but his awareness of the cabin around him remained heightened, every sound and movement sharpening his focus. He could still feel the lingering tension hanging in the air, an almost imperceptible undercurrent that seemed ready to resurface with the slightest provocation. Tom was fully aware that the situation wasn't completely resolved, but he allowed himself to hope that the most challenging moments were now behind them. At the rear of the plane, Karen sat stiffly in her seat, her posture tense and her mind swirling with unrelenting thoughts. She was baffled and deeply frustrated that no one else seemed to share her perspective, unable to understand why they had all sided with Tom and dismissed the danger she was so certain of. Though her anger churned within her, Karen forced herself to contain it, realizing that another outburst would likely escalate matters and further isolate her. Jim stood a short distance away, his watchful eyes fixed on Karen as he remained ready to intervene at a moment's notice. He observed the turmoil reflected in her gaze, and the white-knuckled grip she had on the armrests, a clear indication that she was struggling to keep her impulses in check. Jim stayed on high alert, fully prepared to step in and defuse the situation if Karen's behavior showed any signs of escalation. As minutes slowly ticked by, stretching into an hour, the cabin settled into an uneasy rhythm. The atmosphere aboard the flight became subdued but tense, with passengers quietly turning their attention to books, screens, or whispered conversations. Linda moved through the cabin with practiced calm, discreetly monitoring both Tom and Karen, acutely aware that her efforts were the fragile thread maintaining the peace. After a while, Linda approached Jim, giving him a slight nod to signal her confidence that the situation was stable for the moment. "I think we're in the clear for now," she whispered softly, her tone cautious but hopeful. "Keep an eye on her, and let me know immediately if there's even the slightest sign of trouble," Linda instructed, her voice low but firm. Jim nodded in acknowledgement, his vigilant gaze never wavering from Karen's tense figure. "Will do," he replied succinctly, his focus unwavering. Linda turned and began making her way back through the cabin, her thoughts entirely focused on maintaining the delicate balance of control. She was well aware that the situation had the potential to ignite again at any moment, but she took comfort in the knowledge that for now, they were managing to keep things steady. The aircraft soared steadily through the skies, carrying its passengers closer to their destination, each silently hoping that the tension hanging over the cabin would not rear its head again. In her seat, Karen sat brooding, her thoughts locked in a relentless loop as she fixated on Tom and the perceived threat she was convinced he represented. For the moment, however, she held her tongue, her anger smoldering beneath the surface, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. Meanwhile, Tom maintained his outward calm, though his senses were on high alert, fully aware that his composure was vital to preventing further unrest. As the hours stretched into a slow, uneasy rhythm, the flight carried on with passengers collectively longing for a safe and uneventful landing, both literally and metaphorically. Eventually, the plane started its descent, and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign illuminated the cabin, signaling the final approach to their destination. Captain Harris's composed and reassuring voice broke through the intercom, informing passengers of their approach to Los Angeles and providing an update on the final stages of the journey. Passengers began to stir, stretching stiff limbs or carefully stowing away their laptops and books, preparing themselves for the imminent landing. The air of unease that had lingered heavily over the cabin for the majority of the flight seemed to dissipate slightly as passengers began getting ready for the conclusion of their journey. Tom Johnson noticed the aircraft tilt gently, signaling the start of its descent. He carefully closed the book he had been reading and placed it back into his carry-on bag, double-checking that his medication was still securely tucked inside. He cast a quick glance toward the rear of the plane, where Karen remained seated under Jim's vigilant observation. Although she hadn't caused another scene, Tom could tell from her stiff posture and the nervous way her eyes darted about that she was anything but calm. Linda walked down the aisle one final time, ensuring that all passengers had their seatbelts fastened and were prepared for landing. She stopped briefly at Tom's row, offering him a reassuring smile. "We're almost there," she said softly. "Thank you for being patient." Tom gave a slight nod. "I just want to get through this flight without any further problems," he said. "You've done a good job handling everything," Linda replied with a small nod, clearly grateful for his calm demeanor. "Let's hope it stays quiet until we land." As Linda resumed her walk down the aisle, she caught sight of Jim making a signal toward her. Her pace quickened, and a small sense of unease began to weigh on her. When she reached the back of the cabin, Jim leaned in close and spoke in a low tone. "Karen's been muttering to herself. She's agitated again." We need to be ready in case she tries to do something." Linda looked over at Karen, noticing how she stared intently ahead, her face flushed with frustration. Linda crouched down beside her, her voice soft and calm. "Ma'am, we're about to land. Please stay calm and remain seated. We're nearly there." Karen's eyes darted toward Linda, and in a harsh whisper she said, "This isn't over. I won't let him get away with whatever he's planning. You'll see. All of you will see." Linda felt a shiver run through her but managed to maintain her composure and smile. "Please remain seated until we land. Everything will be addressed once we're safely on the ground," she assured. Karen remained silent but made no attempt to leave her seat. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Linda returned to her station and subtly signaled to Jim to continue monitoring Karen closely. The aircraft steadily descended, and the expansive cityscape of Los Angeles began to emerge below. Linda silently wished that everything would proceed without further incidents once they were on the ground. As the plane finally landed, a unified sigh of relief seemed to pass through the passengers. The familiar noises of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and rummaging through their bags began to fill the cabin. Tom stayed in his seat, fully aware that there was no need to hurry. He patiently waited while other passengers stood up and began taking their bags down from the overhead compartments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Harris's calm voice echoed over the intercom, "welcome to Los Angeles. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off and the aircraft has come to a full stop at the gate. We thank you for your cooperation and hope you enjoy your stay." Tom felt the aircraft slowly taxiing toward the gate. He turned to look out the window, observing the ground crew as they prepared for the plane's arrival. Linda approached him, her expression composed yet determined. "We've contacted airport security," she said in a quiet voice. "They'll be waiting for us once we reach the gate." Tom gave a slight nod. "That's likely the best course of action." "Thank you," he replied. Once the plane came to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers quickly stood up ready to leave the aircraft. Linda and Jim stationed themselves close to Karen, prepared to step in if the need arose. Tom remained seated, aware that he would be one of the last passengers to disembark. He listened to the low murmur of voices around him, a blend of relief and lingering curiosity. The cabin door swung open and two uniformed security officers stepped into the plane with practiced composure. Linda gestured discreetly toward the back of the plane, directing the officers to where Karen was seated. One of the officers, a tall man with a composed and steady presence, walked up to Karen and addressed her in a firm yet calm voice. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us. We'd like to discuss the situation that occurred during the flight," he said. Karen's eyes went wide and she shook her head adamantly. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done anything wrong. It's him. He's the one you should be arresting," she said, pointing. The officer maintained his composure. "Ma'am, we only need to speak with you. If you cooperate and come with us, we can clear everything up," he said in an even tone. Karen suddenly stood, her voice growing louder. "You're all part of this. You're protecting him. I'm the only one who knows what's really going on?" she exclaimed. The second officer, a woman with a steady and firm demeanor, calmly took hold of Karen's arm, her grip secure but gentle. "Ma'am, please calm down. Come with us, and we'll make sure everything is handled properly," she said with quiet authority. Karen struggled against the officer's grip, her voice escalating into a high-pitched cry. "No, this isn't fair. You can't do this to me," she protested. The officers, remaining calm and professional, began to escort Karen toward the exit as her loud protests echoed throughout the cabin. The passengers observed the scene in silence, some appearing startled while others seemed relieved that the matter was under control. Linda walked close behind, making sure that the situation continued to remain managed and orderly. Tom stayed in his seat, silently watching as Karen was escorted off the plane. He could sense the curious gazes of the other passengers directed at him, but he chose to disregard them, instead observing the composed efficiency of the officers. Linda soon returned to his seat, her face showing a blend of relief and weariness. They'll take her to a holding area for questioning, Linda explained in a low voice. We've also alerted the authorities, so the entire matter will be reviewed thoroughly. Tom nodded. Thank you. You've managed everything with a lot of professionalism. I truly appreciate that, he said. Linda offered a faint smile. Just doing my job. I'm glad we managed to get through it without further trouble, she replied. As the final passengers began leaving the plane, Tom stood up and retrieved his carry-on bag. He walked slowly down the aisle, noticing the tension in his shoulders beginning to relax. He gave Linda a final nod before stepping off the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge greeting him as he made his way toward the terminal. In the terminal, Tom spotted Karen being led away by the security officers, her protests continuing to echo loudly off the walls. He observed as they escorted her toward a secure section, her voice gradually fading as she disappeared from view. Tom turned away and began walking toward the baggage claim area, his pace steady and deliberate. The incidents of the flight replayed in his mind, but he reassured himself that he had dealt with them to the best of his ability. While he had encountered far more challenging scenarios in his line of work, the sting of being wrongfully accused still weighed on him. When he arrived at the baggage claim area, Tom exhaled deeply, preparing himself to leave the day's events behind. Behind him, passengers from Flight 287 trickled into the terminal, conversing softly with each other, a few casting curious glances toward where Karen had been escorted. The tension that had marked the flight was gradually giving way to the lively buzz of the airport and the excitement of reaching a new destination. For Tom, however, the day was far from finished. He was fully aware that there were reports to write, questions to address, and much to reflect on. But for now, he allowed the hum of the airport to envelop him, a soothing reminder that life continues even after episodes of tension and miscommunication. As he made his way toward the exit, Tom experienced a renewed sense of determination. The day had undoubtedly been difficult, but he had approached it with poise and professionalism, and in the end that was all one could hope to do, or